welcome to my primary production evaluation. For my primary production, I wanted to create an opening sequence for a film that would fit under the drama thriller genre. Upon researching the genre, I came across some good examples of films that were within the drama thriller category, such as The Conversation, made around the time surveillance technology was developing and becoming ever more intrusive into ordinary people's lives. I noticed a key theme in the narrative was paranoia, which was the world the protagonist, Harry Cool, lived in. To capture his paranoid state, there were lots of shots that just focused on characters. This is quite an iconic feature of a drama thriller when you compare it to an action film, where shots of the characters are short to keep the movie pace quick, along with the all fast-paced action. But the cutting rate in the editing of the film is generally slow in drama thrillers, as it captures tension in real time as opposed to a sped up film time. I also noticed that drama thrillers aren't overly dramatic. The acting is predominantly subtle and truthful. For an example, reactions are not emphasised in a theatrical manner. The characters respond to situations as they would in real life, and so I think the genre holds a great sense of realism. I tried to mirror this in my opening sequence Retrace, where myself and my colleague tried to act naturally in front of the camera. Another genre convention I identified was the sense of enigma. It was evident in both films, The Conversation and The Godfather. Both conveyed this with the use of point-of-view shots, which leave us guessing whose perspective we're looking through. I have included some of this enigma in my opening sequence by hiding the identity of the waiter. This makes the end of the sequence ever more unexpected. I could have included a shot of the waiter's face bearing a sinister expression, for example maybe a smirk, foreshadowing that they may return later in the narrative against the protagonist. Furthermore, my opening sequence puts us straight into the narrative as opposed to a long establishing shot that introduces the setting in an extreme long shot. I noticed in The Conversation and The Godfather that the first shots in the films set scenes that symbolise the themes in the film. For example, The Conversation used an extreme long shot of many people walking through a city, hinting at the intrusive world the protagonist operates in with intrusive surveillance technology. The opening of Retrace shows a tea being poured, which is iconic of a British gentleman stereotype. This informs my audience that we're in a more upper-class setting in Britain. Social groups. My text represents a social class, the upper class. I would say my representation of the upper class, through the character played by Jake Nethercott-Cable, was more regressive, as he is polite to the waiter, but I think it's his behaviour towards the detective that actually affects my representation of the police service. He is at first abrasive with the detective, but eventually complies with him after he's pinned down with a more impatient attitude. Admittedly, this is a regressive portrayal of the police force, as it implies that detectives, especially, are an irritating infringement upon people's lives and that they have to resort to fear tactics to do their job. However, this may also be a misrepresentation of the public, as it implies that detectives are always met with resentment from them when they try to do their job. So it's arguable that the protagonist, again played by Jake, is also a regressive representation, as he creates the idea that upper class people don't mix well with detectives, suggesting they have something to hide, which draws us near to an anti-establishment attitude. Media institutions. I would expect that my text would appeal to such institutions as the BBC as a media product. The BBC is quite renowned for its dramas, which it seems to celebrate, as whenever they launch a trailer for one of their new drama productions, they open with the original British drama logo. The BBC has released several dramas which I would also associate with the thriller genre, such as Peaky Blinders and Happy Valley, which are both gritty. Any forms of humour in series such as these are usually quite subtle, as the narratives are generally dark. The humour is usually a byproduct of released tension. I think my text mirrors this feature, and so would be willingly distributed by the BBC. It's also likely it would appeal to the Netflix market, as they generally accept any kind of film. Netflix appeals to a wide range of people due to its variety. They have films old and new, tame and controversial from a range of different genres. Therefore, I believe my media product would make an addition to their drama or independent films sections. Audience. Initially, I was aiming to create a media text for both genders, male and female. After I conducted my target audience research, I found I had slightly more male responses than female, but I still wanted to have an impartial bias to either gender. However, when it came to filming, I was only able to get male actors, including myself, so there is no female representation in my text. But when making the production, I was not consciously aiming my production at either gender. In contrast, I did try to appeal to older audiences, as my audience survey gained responses mainly from the 18 to 20-year-old bracket, and then some from the 50-plus bracket. I furthermore got feedback from older audiences who said they appreciated the subtle humour. This fits perfectly into the reformist psychographic who believe less is more. I can also relate this point to the feedback I got from my question, what age certificate for films do you most commonly see? And then, why? The respondents, 6-1, said 15 was their most commonly viewed age certificate, and generally this was so they got a good narrative from a film, without too much graphic content. In my audience survey analysis, I said I'd have to consider these points when making my film, as I have little graphic content but evidence of a narrative that could potentially develop. I feel I have delivered a media text that my respondents, from my survey that is, would enjoy. I also found that all of my audience survey respondents considered themselves middle class, and that's C1 and B on the socio-demographic scale, but more so B middle class as opposed to C1 lower middle class. Responding to this, I came up with a narrative that featured middle-class characters, as the respondents would probably be more familiar with the behaviour of a similar class. Attracting and addressing my audience. As I've previously mentioned, I created a questionnaire for my audience so I knew what content or themes to include in my text. In doing so, I gained responses that informed me what would engage my audience. For example, most respondents agreed, in different wording, that 15 certificate films were their preferred rating of film to see because they are not normally too violent. So by producing a media text that represents the preferences of my audience will make them feel engaged, as they will see that they've had a say in the content of the film and have been represented. I also used some other methods in my media text. One example is enigma codes. Firstly, I address the theme of enigma and mystery with concealed identity of the waiter. I then have the sound of footsteps in one shot, coming closer, leaving the audience in ambiguity, wondering who the footsteps belong to. Also, the narrative itself is ambiguous to the audience, as they don't know what the characters do know themselves. But more content is given as the sequence progresses. I believe this is one of the conventions of the drama thriller genre, as the plot keeps you hooked to find out the conclusion to the build-ups and progression of the story. A good example to relate this to is yet again The Conversation, where we are put in the dark as much as the protagonist himself, meaning we moved through the narrative at the same pace as the protagonist. The enigma codes I've identified also help me to lead on to a use of an action code, where right at the end I have my protagonist struck across the face with a tray. This effectively concludes the build of tension throughout the sequence where he is interrogated, creating a dramatic climax. I emphasise this build with the use of tense build-up music, which cuts out just before the action with the tray. Another point I'll mention is my use of an Easter egg, or some intertextuality. I wanted to give a subtle nod to one of my most favourite films which shared the drama thriller genre with my primary production. In one of the document props, one of the subject pictures is of Captain Yossarian from Catch-22. In the end of this film, Yossarian deserts the corrupt American airbase he's stationed at. I allude to the possibility that he is still on the run from the establishment. Furthermore, the other two documents give nods towards some of my own previous media productions. One document features the moustached character from my preliminary production, and the other features a figure covered by a pillowcase who appears in a short film I made for a different media course. Including these little so-called Easter eggs makes the production more personal, but also gives the audience something else to ponder about, other than the narrative. Technologies in the production. Creating this media text allowed me to develop my skills in editing using the software Adobe Premiere Pro. It meant I could work on the timing of cuts, helping me to get a feel of when a scene drags on too long or when it's too brief for the audience to properly interpret the visuals. Therefore, I feel the pace of the sequence works well to keep the viewer engaged. I was originally intending to use two separate pieces of equipment for my recording sequence, a camera and a sound recorder. However, when I started sound checks prior to filming, I found the sound recorder was at fault and would not capture sound without viciously loud background noise. I therefore had to improvise on the spot, and so used my mobile phone to record the sound in an app. When it came to the editing process, the computer could not locate the sound files on my phone, but to my luck, the camera itself did pick up sound, but unfortunately not the quality I had originally intended. So in a way, I already covered myself without realising, but what it did make me realise is that as soon as I book kit in the future, I must immediately check that it all works appropriately before the day of filming in case of any occurrences like the one I suffered, which I just could not predict. What I learned from the preliminary task. To improve my work in this task, I looked back at my weaknesses from my previous outcome for the preliminary task. The main problem I found was the lighting, as some shots are dramatically darker than others in no continual order. This was because I shot my preliminary production in wintertime, where we lose the light a lot faster. When I filmed my primary production, it was spring, and so had more daylight hours to play with. Although this was out of my control, it illustrated the importance of preparation, in particular with lighting, taking into account the season of which you'll be filming in. To improve on this, in the primary production, I filmed my entire narrative outside. This meant wherever the sun was in the sky, we had roughly the same amount of light from start to finish of filming, so it had good consistency and it overall had good continuity.